so I'm on not my usual mic here.
Yep. Yes,
Okay.
I know.
This mic works.
It will when I turn it on.
Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to Lynn at pghcitypaper.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Hey there, and a good morning to you. I've been eagerly looking forward to this conversation. I don't like to think of it as an interview.
True. That's good. It is a conversation.
Yeah, it's a conversation. And the conversation being with Bill Steigerwald, who you see here, who has been a journalist for more years than he cares to acknowledge, mostly with the Pittsburgh Post.
Actually, 10 years at the LA Times in the 80s.
Okay.
10 at the
You just
Post-Gazette
do 10.
in the 90s.
You just do
and
10.
then
And
9.6 at the Trib. I couldn't hang in there any longer.
what is it after about 10? What happens at that 10th? It's like the 7-year itch with marriages, and the 10-year something with you.
You realize you can't change the things that you'd like to change, or that you're up against some really serious
Okay, so you move.
troubles.
All right. So he is also the author of a few books, the latest of which is this, and it's a doozy. I have in the days prior to today suggested that people get this. 30 Days a Black Man.
It's not an autobiography.
It's not.
I did not become a black man for 30 days.
No.
I always like to tell people that right off the bat.
Well, what this clearly is, and more so than I think I realized it would be, is it's history. It's a history. You really have written a history book.
Yeah. I'm a history major. I was.
Oh,
at
you
Villanova,
were.
yeah.
You
English
were.
minor, so I guess it all
Yeah.
worked out.
Well, wow. The year being 1948, and most of the history being that, although you go off and you build back up. I just loved it. I loved it, but
Thank
it
you.
was upsetting.
Yes. I think that a lot of people are shocked by the sort of the weight of all that information about all kinds of things, including what life was like for 10 million black people in the Jim Crow South in 1948, and the politics involved, and the people who were elected to represent states like the state of Mississippi, who,
Oh my
if
God,
we
that
think
guy.
people are bad now.
What was that guy? Bilbo?
Bilbo. And I
Oh my
forget it-
God. Things he would say, you couldn't broadcast. You couldn't
No.
even, a paper couldn't print.
No. And he gave the same scurrilous, unbelievably vulgar, rotten, evil speech over and over on the campaign trails in Mississippi. He had to win the support of the cotton plantation owners and other whites to win the primary in Mississippi. There was no such thing as a Republican Party. So if you won the Democrat primary in the spring, you were basically going to be the senator.
It's sort of like Pittsburgh.
Yeah, kind of like it.
Right, yeah.
And he would go on the stump, and he would give this unbelievable speech, which I
No, you can't. You wouldn't even,
but it was
singe
on
your
radio
ears.
too, by the way, in Mississippi.
It's unbelievable.
It truly is.
Well, words fail. It's the ugliness.
It's shocking,
The
and I think
hatefulness.
you, and I appreciate your praise greatly, and others have said the same thing. Shocking. And it's funny because I spent a couple years a year writing it, but 2 decades almost researching it and just sort of paying
Well, that's
attention
apparent.
to it.
Yeah.
Because I did something at the Post-Gazette in 1998, and I sort of did some other follow-up stories, and so I was sort of like, well, yeah, it was really bad. But when you present
Like what-
it all in a big pile to someone,
Exactly.
they go, holy crap.
Yeah, like I thought, well, I understand. I know Jim Crow. I know. They had to ride in the back of the bus. They had to,
The
I know,
water
separate
fountains,
water
yeah.
fountains. You couldn't do it in the swimming pool, and blah, 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 blah. Oh, my God.
There was no aspect of life for blacks in the South under Jim Crow that was not controlled by a bunch of a web of petty laws and so-called etiquette. Blacks could not address white men as anything other than Mr. If they, I mean, you would get knocked down if you said, "Hey, Joe, how you doing?"
Oh no,
go,
you
oh,
could.
no,
I mean, you would not.
Women had, when they tried on shoes in department stores, had to sit in the back. I mean, the back of the bus, the back of the shoe store on benches to try on.
A woman trying on a hat had to have her hair covered.
Yeah.
You could, but let's be clear. At Kaufman's,
Right up the street.
1948, black women couldn't try on the dresses
You tried it on, you bought it.
because it was tainted, right?
Yeah,
If a black person.
And it's easy to beat up on the Jim Crow South because they were open about their racism and their restrictions on the basic rights of American citizens. In the North, it was more subtle, although
Not all that subtle as you
Yeah.
look at it, because
No.
you look at the Hill, and it almost makes you think the Hill District in 1948 was thriving in terms of black people owning their own businesses.
Yeah.
And as you say, all over in every city and town, blacks had their own newspapers, magazines, radio stations, numbers rackets. They produced their own movies, records, had their own baseball league. They had their own colleges, churches, companies, bars, parks, YMCAs, swimming pools, jazz joints, funeral parlors, taxi cabs, doctors, dentists, and even police.
right, and there were basically two parallel societies, a white one and a black one, and it's really it's all very complicated and far beyond my ken, if that's the word, but there were advantages to segregation to the black community.
That's what I was saying. I mean, I think in some ways someone can bemoan the loss of what they had when they had their own
They were
community.
left alone for good and bad. They were
Right.
not policed properly. They didn't get the sanitation services in the Hill that they should have. But on the other hand, they weren't tortured by cops, too many cops looking for too many bad guys who really aren't bad guys. And so that whole cop race thing almost didn't exist in some neighborhoods because the police
cops,
presence wasn't
They
there.
left them alone.
Which was fine if you're a thief or a drug pusher.
Oh,
Not so
okay,
fine
right.
if you're a middle-class guy living up on the hill
Right.
and you don't particularly like
Right.
the bad guys hanging around.
Okay, so let's get to what this is, because the subtitle of your book is The Forgotten Story That Exposed the Jim Crow South. And this is a story of a Pittsburgh reporter for the Post-Gazette who was the star reporter.
Superstar. He could have been. I make the claim, and I don't think there's anybody around to refute me, and I don't know how you could. He was probably the biggest. He was certainly the biggest media celebrity in Pittsburgh at the time.
Okay.
His face, which we have pictures of, with his goofy Stetson hat, and he would always have his pipe. It was a pretty phony kind of portrait. Must have appeared 1,000 times in the Post-Gazette.
His name was
Drunk Ray Spriggle, Sprigle.
Spriggle.
Rhymes with wiggle, as Time magazine wrote one time helpfully. And he was just known by everybody. I mean, from the governor, who was his friend, to drunks on the street who would say, "Hey, Sprig, how you doing?" And everybody in between. And as far as a newspaper man, he was nationally known.
He was a
because
Pulitzer Prize
right,
winner.
in 38 for what he did in 37.
Yeah.
Which was to go into Birmingham, Alabama, and get the proof that everybody kind of knew was out there somewhere, that Judge Hugo Black recently
Put on
appointed and confirmed and
for the Supreme Court of the United States.
was a very good friend of the KKK in his early days in Alabama, which everybody had to be. If you were running for dog catcher in Birmingham, Alabama, you better have
You were KKK.
yeah, you better be have fealty to the KKK and all.
And so he exposed that.
he brought the proof back, wrote a 5 or 6 part series. It was it was the biggest news story of 1937, which is also makes you wonder about things. On every front page of every major newspaper in the country for weeks, Sprigel's story and the reverberations that it set off was the biggest news of, I forget when it was now, what.
Well, obviously, it didn't unseat Justice
No.
Black, who, ironically,
Yeah.
went on to become
Very good friend of black people, as good as any you could be on the Supreme Court, really.
one of the most liberal members of the court
Yeah.
that he was on.
It's all it. I will now introduce my grand statement about what I learned about doing this, and I think anybody learns when they go anywhere into history. And the more you go deep into anything, obviously it's true, but nothing is new. Everything was worse, and everything we think was simple and black and white, excuse the pun, but it's deliberate, wasn't. And this is so much proof, because you think, oh, well, we know this was this and this.
Well, like you talk about this so-called liberal newspaper editor in the Deep South, whose name rings a bell to political junkies, his name being Hodding Carter. I think
The father of Hodding
Hodding Carter, who was Jimmy Carter's,
No
no
relation.
relation. Jimmy Carter's, what was he? His chief of staff?
He was like a communications guy, and he made his name because of the Iran Contra thing. And when they captured the American
the
intelligence
Americans.
people,
Yeah.
who just happened, they're not doing any harm there in Tehran.
They were.
reading
I believe
newspapers
they
and
were on
things.
vacation.
Yeah. But he became like the
Right.
big spokesman for the Carter administration.
So anyway, but you described him the first time he appears in your book. You describe, I see Hodding Carter, but it's the dad, and you describe him as like the recognized liberal newspaper editor,
spokesman for the New South.
for the New South, and an ardent segregationist.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's in response to your things. Nothing is simple. Excuse me. That the liberal was an ardent segregationist.
And he was an amazing character. When they make the book, and if you know anybody in Hollywood, please tell them. I'll be happy to sketch this out for him. Hodding Carter is an amazing character.
Yeah.
He was a superstar. He was a tremendous journalist, a tremendous editor. He had been educated at Bowdoin in Maine, but he was from like Louisiana originally, and he was a Neiman Scholar and all kind. I mean, he was a superstar.
Yeah.
He wrote novels, he wrote poems, he wrote books, and he ran this paper in Greenville, Mississippi, right in the heart of the Delta, and he wasn't a bad guy relative to the world he was living in. In fact, he got as much hate mail.
Yeah.
And hate from his white readers.
He was enlightened.
Yeah. Yes, relatively so. Absolutely. And he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, Look Magazine, the New York Times, Sunday. He was the guy, when the guys up north deigned to spend any time
thinking about the South.
Yeah. They would call, hey, let's call up Hodding Carter because he's not a complete racist.
He's not an idiot.
Yeah.
Right. Jeez. Okay, so let's get back to poor Ray Spriggle, who we're not talking about.
Yeah. It's so funny because Spriggle, again, a superstar in so many ways. I mean, you could write a whole book about him, and I did not, because I didn't want to write the biography of Ray Spriggle, because I'd still be doing it. And it would take me forever, and I'd be dead. And I wanted to hook it around this trip, which is the greatest of a half dozen major things he did in the
undercover.
city.
He did a lot of undercover journalism, as a miner, a coal miner.
When he was an editor, he said, hey, we're writing about this strike, 20,000 coal miners striking in 1928, I think it was, in Pennsylvania, and we don't know we don't know anything about coal mining. I'm here at a desk, and I'm writing about, so I'm going to be.
I'm going in.
He didn't call up that president of Pittsburgh Coal and say, hey, get me
No,
into
he just got a job as a scab.
He signed up as a scab, but he had to go through. He went through the process, and he went into the mine, and then he wrote about conditions there, and he wrote it as at the time, it was considered a very fair and balanced piece about what it was like. And I mean, he's talking about the showers, the food. These people were locked into the mine, the scabs, and there were other people outside who weren't too thrilled about it.
Well, of course not.
Police protection
Right.
here in Bethel Park.
In
So
Bethel.
it was an amazing. That was an amazing. But that's like the sixth thing. So I mean, I'm not going to go through them. But he decided in '48, at the age of 61, that he would that he was famous for being a friend of the underdog, and he also knew, and was always knew the power of a good story and knew how to find them, and thought, I was thinking about that. So he said, boy, this would be a great story to go into the Jim Crow South for 30 days. And so I can really learn myself, the reporter, or as best I can, what it's really like to live like a black person in the South. And he passed himself off as a light-skinned black man. He tried walnut juice and mahogany bark to stain and some chemicals that would have killed him if he had put them on.
All over his body. None of that
didn't
worked.
Work. One of the black guys he was talking to in Atlanta said, "Hey, just go get a ridiculous tan.
Go down to Florida, get yourself a tan."
He said there's the spectrum of blackness is so wide that there are people who, like Walter White, the head of the NAACP, he was whiter looking than we are. He had blonde hair and blue eyes.
This is the guy who was the head of the NAACP at the time.
From 1932
his name was
33
White,
to 57.
and looking at a picture of him, you would never in a million years say, that guy's black.
But he passed himself. He called himself black.
He
lived
was
like
black.
a black man.
Yeah.
And he could be. Well, I guess I started off on the movie thing. He could be. There could be a movie about him, Walter White. There should be a movie about Harding Carter and all the.
Yeah.
He could do it all.
These people are
internal
amazing.
thing, yeah. And Spriggle himself deserves a movie.
Right.
And so Spriggle goes down south for
But
30
he can't
days.
go down by himself, so he needs a real black guy
Right. So what he
to
did
travel with.
in the fall of 1947, Spriggle arranged a meeting with Walter White, the head of the NAACP.
It just occurred to me, Walter White. That's Breaking Bad.
Oh yeah. That's the only one people know now.
I was just all of a sudden thought, wait a minute, Walter
I did a search
White?
for Walter White at one point, and all I see is
All
Breaking
it
Bad.
is Breaking Bad, the meth deal. The if you ever saw Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
sorry.
he arranges a meeting.
need to get this closer to you, though.
Sorry. Walter White's in town to talk to the NAACP, the local branch up on the hill, and Spriggle meets with him secretly on the hill at
Daisy
Lampkin's house.
Right.
And she had it's still up there, a three-unit apartment building, and she kept the top unit, I think, or one of the units, open so that if Walter White came to town, he had a nice place to stay because he couldn't stay downtown. Neither could Joe Louis. Neither could Louis Armstrong. Didn't matter.
No, didn't
They all
matter. You're
stayed up on the
black.
hill.
You ain't staying. You had to stay. Okay, so
He meets with
and that's
White.
the wonderful North in
Yeah.
this era. Yeah.
He meets with White, and White, who was a masterful lobbyist for his race, a total, unbelievably important, influential person who hung around with FDR, and Eleanor Roosevelt was his big friend, and he tortured Harry Truman to turn him into the first civil rights president. That's all in the book. So he meets with White. White goes, wow. He knows the power of having
he thinks
one
that
of the
would be
best,
a great. And a white
best
reporter.
white reporter in the country doing such a thing. He knew
Because no one would listen to a black reporter doing it.
they had already done. I mean, the Courier was writing about the crap that was going on in the South, the lynchings,
Nobody paid
the
attention.
trials, the degradation, the voting thing, all the time. Nobody paid.
Well, you also point out, and I want to get this: the mainstream media at the time never covered anything going on in the black community except bad stuff.
Generally, that's true. I think. Yes. I mean,
Just did
yes.
not. Did not.
Black papers wrote for black audiences, and they wrote all about everything you wanted to know about the Jim Crow South. You could have found out in an often sensationalistic and graphic,
If you read the Courier.
powerful way. Yes.
But a white person
But
didn't read
reading the
Courier.
Post-Gazette, I think I did a search, and as best as I could do a search for the Post-Gazette for the year 1947 or 48, I forgot what it was. I think Walter White was mentioned once or twice.
Yeah. Black people.
He's the head of the
didn't
NAACP,
exist.
the most important.
Black people just did not exist. So white people did not have a clue. And that
Not
was
really.
that the only way they were going to find out was for
someone,
a white guy in a white newspaper, to tell his white readership
in a powerful and persuasive way.
and personal way.
Yes. And so, and it wasn't
This
like
is
you couldn't
what it
just go
is.
down to Birmingham and say, boy, it's really bad here. This is the most segregated city in the country, and that's really terrible, and write a 10-inch column. That wasn't going to work. He had to immerse himself in that world, and he was capable of doing it because he was a great journalist, but he was also very principled. He was not a civil rights crusader.
No, he wasn't. He was just sort of,
He was a staunch
I think
Republican.
he was an empathetic person, right?
But he knew when what was right and what was wrong, and he was able to say, you know what, the basic U.S. Constitution says this stuff isn't supposed to happen.
Right.
When are we going to give black people
What the
10 million in the
Constitution
South
says.
and another 4 million in the North in 1948? The population of the whole country was about 150 million, so it's about half the size of.
Right.
A little less than half, but so he goes down there and he writes this, and he travels for 30 days, being guided and hosted by a man named John Wesley Dobbs, another superstar.
Another extraordinary human being you don't know about. Right.
In Atlanta, there's his grandson was Maynard Jackson Jr., I guess the first black
mayor of Atlanta was his grandson.
So on his way out the door, he said, "You know what? I loved my grandpa, and he ain't getting the props that he should be." And they named the street that Dobbs lived on John Wesley Dobbs Avenue, and also put up a big sculpture of his head on the corner of the main black neighborhood. Anyway, Dobbs, again, the son of a
former slave.
and who had been impregnated by the slave master. I mean, you know, like half of the people, black people in the South, apparently can have some connection with this. And anyway, Dobbs jumped at the chance to show this. Dobbs was approached by the NAACP. Will you help this reporter?
Will you
He
take
said
him
yes.
around?
Dobbs had 2 cars. In 1948, about 10% of Americans had 2 cars.
That blew me away. Actually, in 1948, only 50% of Americans had one car,
right.
let alone a telephone.
Right.
50% in 48 had a telephone, 50% had a car, and this black man in Atlanta had 2 nice
Self-taught.
cars.
He quoted Shakespeare. He quoted hundreds of poems.
He memorized all of this.
He was
like
a tremendous
Paradise Lost. He had in his head.
Yeah, he was a tremendous orator, in demand all up and down the coast. He would talk to the Masons.
Yes.
Wouldn't let blacks in, so the blacks formed the Prince Hall Masons, which is the black version of the Masons. And he was the head of the Georgia's Black Masons, which gave him power, money, influence that he would, in the black community. But he also leveraged that with the white
politically
mayor.
with the whites.
Yeah. He said he realized he could get blacks to vote in a block, and he would say to the primary guys running for mayor of Atlanta, "Hey, if you give us street lights on our street, if you give us a decent park," which they didn't have in the black neighborhood, I can guarantee you that I will tell my guys to
This
vote
is who
for
you vote for.
Yeah. And he did that.
Yeah.
What's amazing about this is that there are so many little tangents, and you can't really get past them.
It's mind blowing. I know. I know what I wanted to. They are schooled. So he's taking. Dobbs is taking Spriggle into the South. Well, Dobbs doesn't want to get killed, so he needs this white guy masquerading as a black guy to act like a black guy.
Yeah, which is not easy
Which
to
is
do.
not easy to do because a white person grows up with a certain way of even walking. Even the way your head is.
The way you look at women.
The way you look at a woman. The way you approach a building. Can you walk in that door? Can you sit on that bench? All of the things that Spriggle would not have ever... Dobbs had to school him. You cannot do this. You cannot do that. You write, I loved this. So you say, the two of them were briefed. I don't know why at this point Dobbs is being briefed on tactics, strategy, and proper behavior as if they were a pair of elderly saboteurs about to be dropped into Nazi-occupied France.
That was when they went into the Delta, the Mississippi Delta.
So
that was even more
Dobbs
dangerous.
even had to be reminded,
Yeah.
hey, do not even attempt to talk
It was a feudal
to
society.
someone on the side of the road. You see a black person on the side, do not even
Absolutely.
attempt. Even though you're black, do not.
Yeah. I mean, they were driving around in a 1947 Mercury, which wouldn't fit in this. I mean, it's like the biggest thing on the planet. Four doors, big boat, weighed about 2 tons and everything with them in it. And because they were both big men. Dobbs was 66, by the way. Spriggle was 61. So you have these two old coots, both at the height of their powers and their accomplishments, right? Both brilliant in their own ways.
Yeah.
Driving around, interviewing, because Spriggle passed himself off not only as a light-skinned black from the north, but also as a researcher for the NAACP. So he could go to sit in a sharecropper's shack, of which there were probably a 250,000 in the Delta alone, and interview the sharecropper without going like, "Hey, what's this
white guy doing here?" So
why
Dobbs.
is this guy?
It's interesting. So who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? If somebody says he's black, a black person says,
I'm black.
I'm black, and you're looking at him and thinking, but you accept it because why would anybody
Willingly put themselves in that
And
spot.
in fact, speaking of willingly, before Spriggle left on this adventure, he made sure his will was up to date.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Spriggle was amazing because he knew everybody from the governor to the local bookies, and God knows what else, and everything in between. And so he went to the crime guys in Pittsburgh, of which there were quite a few running many things in this very corrupt city at the time.
Oh God!
And he said, "Hey, do you guys know any of your fellow crime guys in the South that in case I run into any trouble and I need to find someone trusted to help me, that I could call, if I run into the county sheriff or whatever problems."
Right.
And they gave him a list of names of people he could call in Atlanta or Birmingham, I imagine white crooks and numbers guys and who knows what.
So here's some of what he told him. Dobbs told Spriggle, stay out of trouble and avoid harm, and the way to do it is to be vigilant as well as meek, lowly, and docile. You always say sir to a white man. If you don't, you could be, again, in big trouble. If a white man, drunk or sober, hits you, you never hit back. You take it. You never argue with the white conductor of a train, bus, or streetcar, or for that matter, with any white man. Do what he says and shut up. You never speak disrespectfully or familiarly to a white woman. If you have the bad luck to bump into a white woman or offend her in any way, don't reply or defend yourself. Just take off your hat, apologize, and back away.
And that was Spriggle writing in one of his 21 columns that that ran in the Post-Gazette from August, say, 10th.
It was a
of
21-part series
Page
that he ends
one,
up writing.
21-part series, syndicated around the country. It was offered to about 130 papers. About 13 picked it up. But it became a national story. Philadelphia Inquirer to the Seattle Times, L.A. Daily News, Cleveland Press, other papers in between, Post-Gazette, Toledo Blade,
Milwaukee
Hartford.
Journal.
Milwaukee Journal, that's right.
And
so your dad may have
may have read it. There is nobody, however, in the South that picked it up.
No, they didn't run one word. And yet the Post-Gazette was, in 1948, they were masters of publicity. When Spriggle went something, they just didn't say, Ray Spriggle is going to write about this thing. They were like pre-publication big ads and teaser ads in the paper and everything else, because he sold papers.
Lest you think television created that kind of thing. No. And
the Post-Gazette was masterful, and they they sold Sprigel's series as this big deal, and it became a big deal. Time magazine wrote about it, Newsweek, other media people.
Eleanor Roosevelt got a pre-publication copy and
through her buddy
mentioned
Walter
it
White.
more than once.
Yes. And so it became, for about 4 months, one journalist from Pittsburgh, not from the New York Times. As I always say, if Sprigel had worked for the New York Times, Spencer Tracy would have played him in a movie in 1950.
I bet you're right.
And someone brought up, and I think it was Maria Shulo at the Post-Gazette, made me either realize or brought it up herself that Sprigel was the Roberto Clemente of the Post-Gazette. Again, they always say about Clemente, if he had played in New York, they'd have a national holiday for him.
Right.
But he played 17, 18 years here, and people are going like,
Man.
yeah, he was okay, but he wasn't as good as, some
Exactly.
goofball who played for the Yankees.
Yeah, always true. Always true. So, there are stories in here that you can almost not bear to read.
Yeah.
And the thing that just made me sick, I was reading this toward the end, and we were talking about the justice system in the South, where a black man could get none. There was no way. There was no way. And yet I'm thinking, so what's so new? It's 2017.
Nothing's new.
Ask the Castile family in Minnesota
Yeah.
if a cop can gun down a totally innocent
On video.
on video
But you know what?
and walk. And it's the same thing, because you say in here that Sprigel reported that people were told, what everybody knew to say if you shot and killed a black man, I thought he was reaching in his pocket.
Yeah, he quotes 3 or 4 cases of streetcar conductors in Atlanta, for some reason, were deputized and were allowed to carry a gun. And at least one case where some young black guy or something gave some lip to the conductor,
Bang, shot him.
and he got off.
I thought he was reaching
Yeah,
in his. So it's the same thing that got the cop off, and I was scared for my own life. I thought he was reaching in, and bang, black guy dead, white guy walks.
Right. I would
different?
say that the difference is that it's not new, this interaction between the police and black people, but I have to think that it was worse then than it is now, because it was more widespread. It was a common, almost universal layer upon 10 million black people.
But when you see that this was an entire culture, hundreds of year culture, and we're now 100 years after, like the Civil War, 100 and some years after, this is something ingrained in America. And clearly, racism in America doesn't budge much.
Sprigel says somewhere in his series that he was very early on in his 30-day trip that he was ashamed to be a white person.
Yeah.
And, I'm a longtime libertarian. You know about me. I'm crazy. And, don't like government, don't like lots of things. Don't like wars in Iraq, and I don't like wars on drugs. I don't like any government war on anything, because there's a lot of collateral damage to the Constitution and all kinds of other things.
So far,
That
I'm
given.
with you.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
And that given, I forget where I was going. I went too far off on my tangent.
Sprigel said.
I felt as a kind of like a doctrinaire libertarian, long time.
You thought government needed to step in? Did you think
well,
that?
in that case, this was a failure of government. The federal government, which, I think you're supposed to enforce the Constitution, aren't you?
Duh.
And I know we have states' rights, and states' rights aren't necessarily bad. It's a good on paper. It should work. Sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it didn't. And all the politics behind why the South was able to carry on for all these years, for 70 years, basically, Jim Crow, all these petty laws that governed everything. They had a black Bible and a white Bible.
I
in courtrooms.
couldn't even believe that was one of the in a courtroom.
And
they
where was
had
the
a
outrage on this? By the way, by the all the good people of the North who would have been like, this is awful. They either didn't know about it because the media weren't telling them,
or it was just taken as a given.
Yeah.
They
It's, I don't know where you go because obviously I don't have any solutions to any of this. I would say though, from a libertarian point of view, we libertarians would say, first of all, the federal government didn't do what it should have done in getting rid of these stupid laws and making black citizens first-class citizens, not second or third-class citizens, subject to these horrible political, economic, and social rules and regulations that have been imposed on them. I mean, that's pretty basic. Their basic freedoms were not allowed to exist in the South.
I know you have things,
levels.
Mark, that you want to read, but I
sorry.
want you to read this one thing. I will read this one little one and then bring you over to where I got it marked. This is Spriggle writing after he's back. Frankly, why the Negro doesn't hate the Southern white is a mystery to me. Mm-hmm. Give me another couple of months Jim Crowing it through the South, forever alert never to bump or jostle a white man, careful always to sir even the most bedraggled specimen of the master race, scared to death I might encounter a pistol-toting, trigger-happy, drunken deputy sheriff or a hysterical white woman, and I'm pretty sure I'd be hating the whole damned white race. Well, man, I've often said, man, if I were born black, I would hate. Okay. I've marked.
And as I've often said, it's a good thing all the black people in the South didn't have like bazookas in their basement because I don't know where we'd be today.
Here and down. I just love this. This again is Spriggle.
Okay. So this is Ray Spriggle again in one of his columns. Your more cynical, educated Negro has a sort of kindly contempt for most of the white race in the South. In business contexts, he is accustomed to outsmarting the white. In cultural contexts, he can't help realizing that quite frequently he is the superior of the white man he's dealing with. But no Negro in the South, no matter who he is and no matter how high his station, ever forgets that the white man always has one final, all-conclusive badge of superiority. The white man can kill him in his tracks in cold blood for fun or for no reason at all, and nothing will happen to the white man. That's the one thing that overshadows every phase of race relations in the South. It's the terrifying specter that leers over the shoulder of every white man who talks to a Negro in the Southland. Why I don't recall hearing a single Negro refer to the Mason and Dixon line. To him, it's the Smith and Wesson line.
That's right. They call it the Smith and Wesson line.
And despite all that, your black man in the South doesn't hate the white. But what he does hate with all his heart is the discrimination and the oppression that dog his footsteps from the cradle to the grave. He hates most of all the fact that he is but half a citizen. He has all of the obligations of a citizen, but not a single one of the rights. He fights and dies for his country, but he can't vote. He pays his taxes at a Jim Crow counter usually, but no Negro in the South has half the representation that a colonist had in 1775. The ringing sentences of the Declaration of Independence are a grim and tragic joke to him. He has no right of liberty that a Southern sheriff, court, or white plantation owner is bound to respect, as witness the fact that he is killed by the score every year and his slayers walk free.
Wow.
So that, I mean, I feel like so ill-equipped to tell Spriggle's story because, as you can see, he's a tremendous writer.
Yeah.
And he says the right things. This is 1948. There wasn't anybody saying, "Oh, you can't say, make sure you say this." Or he was on.
So how was this received by the white audience to whom it was directed?
I think many people were shocked, and many people were very defensive. And whether they lived in the North, well, certainly the South people thought, "Oh, this is just another Yankee do-gooder coming down here to tell us, that our mores and customs aren't right, and we'll go back and we'll be okay, and we'll figure this out." Why, 11% of blacks voted last year in the state of Mississippi. I think as late as '63, 7% of the population only 7% was registered to vote.
of black
in
Mississippi.
the state of Mississippi. I think that's true.
And that was just out of absolute fear?
Partly fear, but the whole system. They would let them register, and then right before the election, they would purge the things for all these, stupid reasons and things. Or they would just intimidate.
Well, that's going on a little bit today.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the thing. Nothing is new.
Nothing.
It was worse then, I would say. But you're right. All of these issues, whether it's voting, whether it's economic rights, whether it's the cops and police and policing, they're still with us. And they were really with us in 1948, North and South. And for your listeners, as I said to you earlier, they should get the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. The subtitle, which warms the hearts of libertarians, but he is no libertarian. He is a member of, has something to do with the NAACP
Legal Defense,
which is not part of the NAACP. But anyway, and the subtitle is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And it's a scathing, deep, wonderfully written indictment of the federal, state, and local laws, everything from housing and housing policies, federal housing policy, which had written into them statements: no non-Caucasians can get these loans. No non-Caucasians could live here.
Yeah,
and they segregated stuff, and then they perpetuated that segregation with a whole bunch, everything from aiming interstates at black neighborhoods like they did here, and in Cincinnati and other cities around the country. They deliberately did it. It wasn't like, oh, we just happened to, look, we wiped out a black neighborhood. I wonder where they're all going to live now.
8,000 people who lived in the lower hill.
And that was urban renewal, he talks about that. Citing of schools so that they would remain segregated, even in the city, without, in theory, it's not.
And it still goes on. You're right.
So nothing has changed.
Aye.
But some things have changed, and it is better.
It's better.
Rothstein's book is going to be, I've been saying this for months, and I think it's going to come true, but it's very well received, and it is powerful and important, and it is a big book.
You think a must read?
Yeah, I think so. I wish I had it when I wrote this, because I mentioned a couple of these private covenants and like what they did to the lower hill and all that stuff, because that was one of my least favorite things that has ever been done in the city of Pittsburgh, is what City Hall, the corporate powers, the Democrat Party, the people who ran this town, looked at the hill, and early on in the 40s, they were, oh boy.
That's some good real estate.
Let's clear
we
cut
don't
that
want these
baby.
black folk here.
And what they did to the lower hill was an absolute crime. And he mentions that and many other things. And if you think, it's kind of funny, this book that I've written, thank goodness, has affected people like you.
Yeah.
But you're a softie. You're a good bleeding heart liberal.
I'm a softie.
My friend Nick Gillespie, who's a Reason magazine editor, said he wept. He didn't weep. He wept. And when he read the full, he probably read it in 3 hours, or he probably just and then he went, wow, and he was like, how horrible was
No,
this?
you're.
So maybe I did something right.
I think you did something incredible, and I mean the reality of your dogged research and the stuff you drop in here about our history that I never, ever knew.
Well, that's good.
And
that's
I
good.
think I know stuff. I think
Well, I thought I knew stuff too. I mean, everything I put in here is pretty much new to me too. And
we
I
sort of
learned.
it occurred to me. I kept thinking, my son once blew me away when he was 5 or 6, maybe 7, by saying, "Mom, I figured out something that I'm going to be for Halloween, and it's really scary." What, say I, the straight person?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going as a Jim Crow law.
Jim Crow law?
That's what he said. I'm going as a Jim Crow law.
Did he explain what that means?
Well, he knew it was something real scary.
Oh, okay.
He
He didn't know how to
make it
turn
into
that
a
into
costume. But he was saying,
yeah.
You want scary? I'm going to be a Jim Crow law.
Yep. And luckily, the Great Migration of blacks from the South to the North, which started, I guess, in 1910, 15, somewhere there, in part to get jobs for the war effort, and then later for World War II. At least they could get on a train. Black people could get on a train and go north. And they did it in dribs and drabs, and then it became the Great Migration. And I guess, I don't know, 5-6 million blacks over 50, 60 years went north into the cities. They went to Chicago. They went to Detroit. They went to Pittsburgh. They went to Philly and New York. And at least they could escape Jim Crow. But they
found themselves in a different kind of...
Yes, but it was not like heaven. I'm trying to think where... They say New York City was the best at the time. And that was not... I mean, it was not great, but it was certainly seemed like... And irony, Tom Dewey, the
Republican who...
was held up as the best example of a governor who had liberalized his state in on racial issues in the best way.
And got beaten by Harry Truman, who, by the way, integrated the
armed forces.
But I think some of the most wrenching stories here are of black veterans coming home from World War II, having fought
wearing
for the
a
freedom,
uniform, getting shot
wearing
dead.
a uniform, having fought for the freedom of others, and getting gunned down for trying to vote.
It's really scary that this occurred, and it's not like there wasn't anyone in the South who said, you know what, this isn't right. But the overwhelming majority and the culture and the framework of that culture, the legal and everything else, political, just, so even if Harding Carter, as relatively good as he was, he got hate mail for putting Jesse Owens' picture on the front page of his paper.
That was an outrage.
But he was still willing to do that. He was pushing an envelope. It was, I don't know, I'm losing track of the metaphor, but the envelope was pretty damn big. But he was at least trying to push against it in the smallest way. But he did not want to see the integration of any public buses or schools or anything in the South.
It's just beyond belief. Well, you point out, 1948, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who would sign the Civil Rights Act. 1948, LBJ was a rock-ribbed segregationist. And over in California, a guy named Ronald Reagan was a flaming liberal.
Democrat,
and
union leader.
And a union leader. Which goes to your people change, which goes
absolutely.
to Hugo Black,
Right.
KKK, into a liberal jurist.
There's lots of little side fights and things, and I don't know where I found them all, but thank God for the internet, because I didn't go, I went to the Library of Congress, and I went to other libraries here in Pittsburgh, and I can't remember where I went. But without the internet, where you can actually read Truman's 1947 speech that Walter White goaded him into delivering to the NAACP annual conference in D.C.,
which blew people away.
And yes, and it was buried in most papers.
Right.
But the New York Times, my beloved New York Times, put it, I think, on the front page with a big picture. They understood what Truman was doing. He was declaring war basically on Jim Crow. He didn't mention the word black or Negro or anything, but everybody knew when Truman said it is time for the federal government to start making sure and using its powers to make sure that people, he didn't even say he just said everyone. He didn't say black people.
No, he didn't.
Everyone.
It was all very sort of coded and, but he definitely was flagging this is something that's got to change. And, okay, so Spriggle had some impact. I mean, he started
I think he did.
Greasing the... And by the way, everybody says, well, what about Black Like Me? What about Black Like Me?
13 years
because
later.
that was written in 1961.
Yeah.
Okay.
And John Howard Griffith said at one point in his life he did not know about Spriggle's thing.
That's odd.
Yeah. But remember, no internet.
Yeah, okay.
So you'd have to have gone to and by 1961 you had Brown versus Board of Education. You had Emmett Till's murder. You had Little Rock and probably some other things, and Rosa Parks. All that
So
and the
people
TV
were-
coverage, right,
yeah.
had swept away anything before it. So Spriggle just did with words. No pictures, no iPhones. Can you imagine how you? I mean, if you did such a thing today and you took out your little iPhone and Mr. Sharecropper, can I take your picture for Walter White's purposes? I mean, what you'd have. So without photos, without video, obviously, just with the power of his words, the power of his reporting, and the power of his principle too, to see what was wrong, identify it, and then put his butt on the line to, he didn't hold back. In fact, if anything, he hyperbolized some of it. He didn't. There was nothing objective about his series. Or
No,
his-
I mean, you could tell from what we've read.
Yes.
I mean, he was
he let it
he
rip.
was enraged.
And it was interesting because in 1948 he had the authority. He would write 21-part series later, actually, but 21-part series on crime in Pittsburgh, and he'd tell the Pittsburgh City Hall how they should reform their police, and they would say, "Oh, okay,
Okay, we'll do that.
some of that
I mean,
stuff."
he even had Davy Lawrence as mayor's jump and say,
Yeah.
"Okay, those are some good suggestions. We'll get right on it."
He had authority.
So this is 30 Days a Black Man. Please, knowledge is power. We need to know our history, and this is a heck of a contribution to knowing our history. Bill Steigerwald, what a good job, guy.
Thank you.
Good job. All righty.
I'll hire you.
That's
you
enough
very much.
reality, right, for
Yeah.
today. You can go play now. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.